Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back, far, far before manicured cemeteries and marble tombstones. Before the quiet order of churchyards and headstones, there was, well, mostly confusion. People have been dying for as long as people have been living, a pattern that continues to this day, despite our best efforts. So, get comfortable, dim the lights. Let's sink gently into a time when dealing with the dead was less about solemn tradition and more about doing whatever seemed least likely to attract wolves. Long before anyone thought to call a patch of land a cemetery, death was domestic. When someone died, you didn't send them off to a funeral home, you became one. Families often buried their loved ones right next to the house or under it, which sounds morbid until you realize it was also a form of real estate planning, because nothing says this land is mine quite like Grandpa buried under the kitchen floor. And this wasn't strange at all. For thousands of years, it was normal. The earliest human communities lived close to their dead, partly out of reverence and partly out of sheer inconvenience. You couldn't exactly haul a body to the next valley when there were saber-toothed cats waiting. The oldest evidence of human burial comes from around 100,000 years ago. At that point, humans, or at least something very close to us, had already decided that corpses were worth more than just leaving in the open. In places like Kabsa Cave in modern-day Israel, archaeologists have found skeletons carefully placed, sometimes sprinkled with red ochre, a kind of natural pigment. We don't know exactly why. Perhaps it symbolized blood or rebirth, or perhaps they simply thought red was a nice color. And even then, the act of burial hinted at something larger, an awareness of mortality, and maybe the first flicker of anxiety about what happens after. So really, when you think about it, every grave since then is just a continuation of the world's oldest existential crisis. In prehistoric Europe, the Neolithic period introduced something new: communal graves. People began building massive stone tombs, what we now call megalithic barrows or dolmens. These were large, impressive structures built for entire communities or extended families. In other words, the first group project no one volunteered for. Inside, they would layer bodies over generations, arranging bones, sometimes rearranging them. Archaeologists have even found cases where skulls were removed and displayed elsewhere. Apparently, once the flesh was gone, Grandma's head made for a lovely conversation piece. And to them, this wasn't disrespectful, it was intimacy. The living and the dead were part of the same ongoing household, separated only by decomposition. Now, let's drift east to ancient Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, and incidentally, of many bad smells. In early cities like Ur, people buried their dead right beneath their homes. Basement crypts were quite popular, mostly because having your ancestors nearby was thought to bring protection. Also, it saved space in those tight urban layouts. But as cities grew and more people died, as they tend to do, things got complicated. Eventually, larger burial grounds formed outside the city walls. And this is the faint beginning of what we might one day call a cemetery, a place set aside for the public dead. Still, the boundaries were fuzzy. One person's tomb was another person's garden plot. And the wealthier you were, the less likely you were to stay in the ground. Nobles and kings built elaborate tombs meant to outlast everyone else's, because if you couldn't take your wealth with you, the next best thing was to turn yourself into a monument. The afterlife apparently had a good real estate market for stone ego projects. Ancient Egypt, of course, took this to an art form. They treated death as a full-time job, and one that required an unreasonable amount of linen. The Egyptian approach to disposing of the dead wasn't really disposal at all. It was extreme preservation. They went to great lengths to ensure that the body stayed as intact as possible, because they believed the soul needed it later. So while everyone else was still digging shallow pits, the Egyptians were busy building pyramids, essentially enormous delivery boxes for the afterlife. You can almost imagine the first guy to suggest it. Let's build a small hill made entirely of stone and fill it with dried people. And everyone just agreed. It's hard to overstate how much effort went into this. Mummification took weeks, sometimes months. The body was drained, dried, stuffed, wrapped, and then entombed with all the essentials for eternity: food, furniture, jewelry, and the occasional pet. Because naturally, if you were rich enough to have a cat in life, you'd want one to follow you into death. The poor, however, did not get such luxury. Their bodies were often buried in the hot desert sand, which, ironically, preserved them quite well by accident. So, in the end, some farmers achieved the same result as pharaohs, just without all the ceremony. Meanwhile, over in ancient Greece, things took a different turn. The Greeks loved a good funeral, partly because it was a social event. They practiced cremation quite early, turning bodies to ash and placing them in urns. It was efficient, clean, and, let's be honest, convenient in those rocky hills. Cremation also carried a philosophical tone. It released the soul from the body. The smoke rising to the sky symbolized the spirit's ascent, or at least that's what people said while trying to ignore the smell. Funerary feasts were common, where relatives would gather, eat, and drink to the deceased. In some places, they even left food for the dead, a custom that, centuries later, evolved into offerings and, eventually, Halloween candy. The Romans, being practical and slightly neurotic, adopted both burial and cremation at different times. Early on, they preferred cremation: efficient, neat, minimal fuss. But by the 2nd century AD, burial became fashionable again, especially among Christians who believed in bodily resurrection. So, Romans built catacombs, vast underground networks where they interred their dead in stacked niches. If you've ever walked through one, you know they're eerily quiet. Miles of tunnels lined with bones, faint carvings, and the occasional sense that someone's still down there, judging your life choices. The poor were often dumped in mass graves outside city limits. Rome's puticuli, or stinking pits, were where those without money or friends ended up. Workers would throw in bodies, cover them with lime, and move on to the next layer. It was not a glamorous way to go, but it was economical. When the Roman Empire collapsed, burial customs fragmented across Europe. Without centralized control or consistent religion, people reverted to local traditions. Some buried in fields, some in forests, some on high ground, because apparently, even in death, real estate was about location, location, location. Then came Christianity, and with it the idea of sacred ground. Churchyards became the favored spots, because being close to a holy building was believed to improve your odds in the afterlife. People wanted proximity to saints, relics, and blessings. This led to overcrowded churchyards, especially in cities. By the 12th century, some burial grounds were so packed that new graves were being dug straight through old ones. Imagine a medieval gravedigger unearthing last year's skeleton just to make room for this year's. He probably sighed, muttered something about job security, and kept digging. Of course, when you pile thousands of decomposing bodies into one small plot of land, things happen. Unpleasant things. The smell, for instance. Also the groundwater contamination, which no one fully understood at the time.
There are records from medieval London of people complaining that their neighborhood wells tasted suspiciously like death. And naturally, rather than stop burying bodies in the middle of town, the solution was to simply complain louder. It wasn't until the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century that people finally began to rethink their relationship with the dead. So many died so quickly that the old churchyards couldn't cope. Mass graves were dug in fields, ditches, and even abandoned quarries. People were buried without ceremony, wrapped in sheets, stacked in trenches, covered in lime. And still, there weren't enough gravediggers to keep up. The image of medieval Europe at that time wasn't one of peaceful rest. It was desperate triage. Bodies were burned, dumped, or even left in streets when no one was left to move them. And through all that chaos, the first murmurs of a new idea emerged. Perhaps, someday, there should be designated places for the dead, far from where the living drink their water. But let's not drift too quickly ahead. For centuries more, burials remained a haphazard affair. In some places, bones were periodically exhumed to make room for newcomers. The older remains would be stacked neatly in ossuaries, stone rooms filled wall to wall with skulls and femurs, arranged almost decoratively. It sounds macabre, but there was a strange sort of beauty in it, a reminder that everyone, in the end, becomes part of the same collection. Perhaps the most famous of these is the catacombs of Paris, where the bones of over 6 million people line endless tunnels. Each skull a quiet resident of eternity's strangest apartment block. And so, the story of how people disposed of bodies before cemeteries isn't a single tale. It's a gradual, messy evolution. From caves to crypts, from pyramids to plague pits, from the family hearth to the churchyard. Every culture, in its own way, tried to make peace with decay, and every generation found new ways to disguise the fact that death never really leaves the neighborhood. Let's drift onward, shall we? In the next part, we'll sink into the strange world of medieval graveyards, where burial wasn't just about faith, but about money, superstition, and occasionally, the black market in bones. Because of course it was.
So, as we drift gently forward, we arrive in medieval Europe, a time when the dead were no longer hidden in distant fields or sand dunes, but rather neighbors. Churchyards, those quaint plots of consecrated earth, were meant to organize death. In practice, they often organized chaos instead. You see, space in a medieval village was limited. The wealthy wanted to be buried closest to the church, naturally for prestige, and perhaps a little divine insurance. The poor ended up wherever they could fit, sometimes along the edge of a ditch, beneath the shade of a gnarly oak, or even behind someone else's grave. It was less of a community cemetery and more of a patchwork quilt, stitched together with bones. Gravediggers were, in many ways, the unsung specialists of this era. They dug through last year's occupants to make room for the new arrivals, muttering under their breath about job security and unpleasant odors. They developed an intimate knowledge of human anatomy, far beyond what any monk or scholar could hope to achieve without the added incentive of necessity. And when space ran short, as it inevitably did in the bustling towns, older bones were sometimes exhumed, cleaned, and stored in ossuaries. Yes, ossuaries, stacked walls of skulls and femurs, sometimes arranged decoratively. It's hard to describe the serenity of such a place, if by serenity you mean the quiet realization that every visitor is essentially walking among several generations of neighbors. Meanwhile, the living adjusted their routines accordingly.
Children might play near graves, dogs trotted between tombstones, and market-goers carried baskets of bread along paths lined with corpses. The boundary between life and death was thin, sometimes literally a fence or a hedge thick enough to keep wandering goats out, but not much more. And yet, for all the practical challenges, it worked. Life carried on, death carried on, and people grew oddly comfortable with the constant reminder of mortality. It's also worth noting that medieval superstition flavored these churchyards with a gentle layer of fear. The dead were thought to influence the living, either benevolently or otherwise. Graveyards were avoided after dark, not because of wolves, though, admittedly, wolves were still a concern, but because wandering spirits might be offended. Candles and small crosses were left at fresh graves to appease the recently departed, a subtle negotiation between the living and the dead. The rituals of burial were as much about social order as about faith. The wealthy commissioned tombs with inscriptions, effigies, and occasionally animals sculpted in stone. Poorer villages might have a simple wooden cross or a small mound of earth, barely distinguishable after a few rainy winters. And the clergy kept meticulous records, mostly of who had paid for burial rites and less so for spiritual reasons. Even the placement of graves could be political. Burials near the church were coveted, and disputes occasionally arose over whose bones deserved the prime spots. This led to an unspoken hierarchy. The richer you were, the closer to sanctity you rested. Death in medieval towns was just another reflection of social inequality, albeit quieter and with more worms.
Weather and season played their parts too. Frozen winters made digging a task of brute force and ingenuity. Hot summers accelerated decay, making prompt burial not just a matter of piety, but of public health, though they didn't quite call it that yet. Rain muddied paths and softened graves, turning solemn rituals into slippery, awkward ceremonies. Yet, despite all these inconveniences, life in a churchyard was steady, predictable, and strangely communal. The churchyard, with its crooked crosses, lichen-covered stones, and bustling edges, became a mirror of the town itself. Life and death coexisted with a quiet rhythm. Everyone knew their neighbors, living and deceased, intimately. Stories were told about certain graves, rumors spread about supposed hauntings, and occasionally someone claimed to see a familiar face among the trees. Mostly it was the imagination, although occasionally it was just a goat. As the centuries passed, population growth made the crowded churchyards increasingly problematic. Bodies stacked atop one another, wooden markers rotted away, and bones resurfaced in unexpected places. Some churchyards resorted to expanding walls outward or digging deeper pits to accommodate the ever-increasing numbers of villagers. Occasionally, gravediggers stumbled across centuries-old skeletons, leading to an impromptu history lesson, though with less academic rigor and more stench. And then, of course, came the plague, the Black Death. It overwhelmed even the most organized churchyards. Mass graves were dug with little ceremony, shrouded bodies stacked and sprinkled with lime. The living learned quickly that traditional burial practices could not keep pace with mortality. Entire communities watched neighbors disappear, streets emptied, and the churchyards grew wider, deeper, and far less tidy. Despite all this, churchyards remained central to medieval life. They were places of memory, of faith, and occasionally of scandal. They taught the living humility, reminded them of mortality, and even offered a strange comfort that death was not distant or abstract, but immediate, tangible, and quietly present. And when the plague subsided, people returned to their rituals, adapting, adjusting,
and continuing the delicate balance between reverence, practicality, and the occasional petty dispute over prime burial spots. So, as we slowly emerge from the shadowed lanes of the medieval churchyard, it's worth noting how enduring these spaces were. They were, in their own understated way, both functional and symbolic, grounding communities in the presence of the dead while letting life carry on around them. Because, of course, death never truly takes a holiday.
Tonight, we're drifting over to a slightly quieter corner of the medieval world. Let's dim the lights, pull the blankets a little tighter, and wander into places where the living and the dead were not so much neighbors as roommates. Long-term, inescapable roommates. Places where bones were more than evidence of mortality. They were material for artistry, architectural experimentation, and perhaps inadvertently, a certain macabre sort of decor. Yes, we are going to speak gently about ossuaries. Imagine, if you will, a small European village, sometime in the 14th or 15th century. The churchyard is full. There isn't a patch of soil left that hasn't already been claimed by someone who had, perhaps inconveniently, died before their time. And so, practicality met artistry, or at least the medieval version of it. The older bones were exhumed, cleaned, and carefully arranged in what we now call ossuaries. These were rooms, chapels, or sometimes entire basements devoted to neatly stacking skulls, femurs, and other bones in patterns that were simultaneously functional and strangely decorative. Let's drift over to one of the most famous examples, the Sedlec ossuary in the Czech Republic. Naturally, the place was overcrowded. Estimates suggest the remains of around 40,000 to 70,000 people are contained there. At some point, someone had the bright idea that mere piles of bones would be improved by a little artistry. Skulls were lined up like sentinels, femurs formed chandeliers, and entire walls were constructed from bone bricks. It's both horrifying and impressively neat, if we're being honest. And, as always, in the medieval period, this was done under the auspices of piety, because nothing says devotion quite like walking beneath the chandelier of Tibia. The individuals responsible for these creations, the craftsmen of bones, were not artists in the modern sense. They were often grave diggers or parish sextons, men intimately familiar with anatomy, decomposition, and the occasional awkward odor. But necessity, combined with a hint of medieval eccentricity, transformed their grim expertise into a form of interior decoration. And yet, despite the utilitarian origins, the aesthetic appeal was undeniable. Patterns emerged, symmetry was valued. Some ossuaries even incorporated floral motifs, made entirely out of bone naturally, because why not? Now, these places weren't for casual visits. The living didn't wander in for a leisurely stroll the way we might today in a park. Ossuaries were quieter, more solemn spaces, often entered only for certain rituals, commemorations, or, occasionally, for the more curious townsfolk with a taste for the unusual. Imagine the smell, a faint, lingering reminder of mortality, softened somewhat by centuries of dust and time. Candlelight would flicker across walls of skulls, and the echoes of footsteps made the space feel almost cathedral-like, despite the unusual material. The practice of stacking bones was not confined to the Czech lands. France, for instance, developed its own fascination with ossuaries, culminating in the catacombs of Paris. Beneath the bustling streets, miles of tunnels held the remains of millions. The bones were arranged decoratively, almost obsessively, to create walls, arches, and even skeletal patterns on ceilings. It is said that the catacombs were as much about practicality, clearing the city's overflowing cemeteries, as they were about aesthetics. But still, a visitor walking through those corridors could not help but notice the effort put into the placement of each skull and femur. There was pride in precision. One might pause and wonder, what drove this desire to arrange the dead? It wasn't vanity exactly, though perhaps a little bit.
It was a mixture of practical necessity, reverence, and the human tendency to find order in chaos. In a world where death was never far from daily life, where infants and adults alike could vanish in a season, managing the remains of the departed was part of maintaining a semblance of control. If life was fleeting and unpredictable, at least the bones could be orderly. And yet there was something slightly whimsical in the whole endeavor. In the Sedlick ossuary, for example, a chandelier was crafted from every bone in the human body. Every single bone. That's not just organization, that's an oddly playful, if morbid, celebration of human anatomy. It's almost as if someone paused mid-work and thought, yes, we are indeed mortals, but why not make a statement? There is humor in it, quiet and dark, the sort of humor that only centuries of coping with mortality can produce. Let's drift over to a smaller, less famous ossuary in southern Germany. The bones there are arranged to form crosses, hearts, and even geometric patterns that mimic stained glass windows. These designs suggest that even in death, there was an attempt to reflect the beauty of life and faith. Perhaps the living found comfort here, a gentle reminder that though mortality was inevitable, it could be ordered, framed, and even celebrated aesthetically.
It's worth noting that not everyone approved. Some clerics frowned upon the arrangement of bones as decorative, seeing it as vanity or even blasphemy. Others accepted it, interpreting the practice as a physical meditation on mortality. The bones reminded the living that death was ever present and that one should live piously. After all, if you walked beneath a chandelier of tibiae, you might consider temperance, or at least you might consider not being late to your next burial service. The aesthetics of ossuaries were sometimes extended to inscriptions and adornments. Inscriptions in Latin, painted or carved, reminded visitors of the fleeting nature of life. Mottos like Memento Mori or Remember You Must Die were commonplace, subtly echoing through corridors lined with skulls and femurs. Gold leaf or traces of colored pigment were occasionally applied to the bones, though faintly, enhancing the visual impact without overwhelming the natural somberness of the space. It's gentle decoration, in a medieval sense, light gilding over the most permanent human remains imaginable. In smaller villages, ossuaries served another function, community memory. Families could see generations stacked together, their ancestors literally forming the walls of the chapel. Children grew up observing the careful order of bones and slowly absorbing a subtle lesson about mortality and kinship. The dead were not distant or abstract. They were tangible participants in daily life. One might even say that in these places, the dead achieved a form of domestic prominence usually reserved for the living elite. Of course, the living sometimes intervened in ways that modern observers might find unsettling. Occasionally, skulls were moved to create new designs, femurs swapped to adjust symmetry. The living curated the dead, managing them almost like furniture or architectural materials. Yet, as grim as it sounds, this management was performed with respect. The bones were not desecrated carelessly. They were carefully handled, cleaned, and incorporated into the ongoing rhythm of village life. By the 17th century, ossuaries had evolved even further. The Paris catacombs were expanded, organized with remarkable precision. Bones were cataloged, stacked with careful attention to aesthetic patterns, and corridors were mapped like streets. Visitors could follow signs along the tunnels, observing the artistic arrangement, the walls of femurs and skulls forming a hauntingly beautiful urban landscape beneath the city. There was a solemn poetry in it, a quiet acknowledgement of the countless lives that had passed and the inevitability of death. And yet, even in such ordered spaces, there was room for a touch of medieval humor. Occasionally, skulls were arranged with eye sockets aligned in a way that almost suggested expression, mocking, bemused, or perhaps indifferent. One could imagine a visitor pausing and feeling as though a centuries-dead villager were observing them, raising an eyebrow in mild judgment. It's subtle, of course, and entirely in keeping with the medieval taste for quiet, restrained irony. The use of bones as decoration, then, is not merely an oddity or a curiosity. It reflects a worldview in which life, death, and the divine were intertwined in physical space. The medieval mind, confronted daily by mortality, found ways to integrate it aesthetically, spiritually, and socially. In arranging the bones of the deceased, communities maintained order, taught moral lessons, and occasionally expressed an oddly playful creativity. One might wonder if there was ever discomfort. Undoubtedly. But in a world where death was constant, where the line between living and dead was thin, ossuaries provided a controlled, predictable environment. The chaos of mortality was transformed into architecture. Fear was softened by routine and ritual. And for centuries, visitors walked those corridors, observing, reflecting, and perhaps whispering prayers to those who, in their final arrangement, were both neighbors and art. In a way, ossuaries are the medieval equivalent of a gentle lullaby about death. Not terrifying, not shocking, but quiet, orderly, and oddly comforting. They remind us that mortality, though unavoidable, can be approached with care, thoughtfulness, and even a hint of artistic sensibility. So as we drift away from the candlelit chambers of bones, let's carry with us the notion that in the past, the dead were not simply hidden away or ignored. They were curated, arranged, and integrated into the living world in ways that were practical, reverent, and occasionally whimsical. The bones of generations became walls, chandeliers, and decorative motifs, forming a quiet dialogue between the living and the dead that persisted across centuries. And if you're still awake, consider this. Somewhere beneath a European street, in a dark, cool chamber, the meticulous arrangements of long-dead villagers continue to exist, silent, patient, and oddly beautiful. They are the ultimate reminder that while life is fleeting, the traces we leave, whether in art, architecture, or bone, can endure far beyond our time. Let's drift softly onward, imagining the muted glow of candlelight on carefully stacked skulls, the scent of aged stone and dust, the whispers of lives long concluded, yet still present in the gentle rhythm of ossuary walls. And with that, we move quietly toward the next corner of history, where death, life, and ritual continue their slow, intertwined dance.